Hey everyone. Our previous class, we were looking primarily at sort of the how of comparative politics. So this was things like inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning, what is the comparative method, and just kind of how do political scientists go about the work that they do in comparing these different countries, or often we call them cases. And we did talk a little bit about the particular things that they would look at, but we're going to go deeper with that today, particularly centered on a few things. And what we're going to see, we're going to start with the idea of states. And essentially, from there, there's going to be other ideas that are kind of built into the idea of states. They're sort of both built in and built on the idea of a state. But all of these together kind of form a country. And we're going to start off with what is a state. And you'll notice that there's some words here that we kind of use commonly, like we talk about a state, like the state of France, the state of Colombia. But then we're going to kind of ask, well, what does that really mean? So, all right. Okay. So as we see this illustration, we have a little pyramid here where we have the state at the bottom and then a regime, that's how you say that word, regime, that zha sound, regime, and then a government at the top. So obviously the state then is the one that is kind of most foundational, that it's the most difficult to change. And then regime a little bit easier to change, uh, but then up to the government, which is the one that would be changed most frequently. And it's built on the regime, which is built on the state. So a way we talk about that is we say that a state is very strongly institutionalized. And as we kind of go up this pyramid, we go from strongly to weakly institutionalized. We talked yesterday about what an institution is. It's kind of this ingrained part of a society and how things operate. And so another way we could think about this is a state is very ingrained in what a country is, where meaning like it's very much a part of it, and it would be so really tough to change that identity of what a state is. And then on up to through regime, and then finally government. A government can change pretty frequently. Okay. And you may hear a little thunder in the background. I don't know if the mic's picking that up. Sorry if so, but maybe it adds a little bit of interest. Okay, so what is the state? First up, a state is defined as an institution, well, yeah, that's the way of putting it, an entity that maintains a monopoly of force over a given territory. Another way of saying that is it maintains a monopoly of violence over a given territory. That sounds a little strange, and we're like, what does that mean? A monopoly of violence. Well, what that means is it is the only institution that is able to perpetrate violence in a legitimate fashion. So if I go out and just like attack people just because I don't like them, well, I am not doing that legitimately because I am not a representative of the state. States, however, are allowed to employ things like police forces who are given this sacred trust to say, okay, they have a right to use force to enforce the law, to maintain order. Doesn't mean that they don't abuse that power. That can happen, of course, but they still hold the legitimacy to say they're the ones who are supposed to have this power. They might misuse it, but they are supposed to have it. They're allowed to have it. Okay. Um, a state is also a set of institutions that establish order, implement policies, and resolve or deter conflict. Deter means like stop conflict. So because they have been kind of granted the ability to use force, that affords them the ability to do these other things, to establish order, implement policies, kind of set up the rules for how society will function. Okay, so you have these different institutions like army, police, taxation, all those that are an aspect of what the state is and how it functions. And I already talked about this, a state is typically highly institutionalized. I mean, it's really tough to shake what the idea of a state is. If tomorrow there was a full revolution in Colombia and like whole new government came in and we're like, what's happening? We don't know. Well, we would still say it's still Colombia. It still maintains its identity, especially when you look like as Colombia would relate to the rest of the world, people would still recognize this territory as Colombia. So to actually change what the state is, to toss out that institution, you'd probably need to be conquered by someone else, maybe have a civil war where it's split into two areas. It's really tough to shake what the state is because it's so heavily or highly institutionalized. And the state is sovereign. Sovereign means it's able to carry out actions and policies independent of external actors and internal rivals. And it has physical strength and power, but it's not just about its strength or power to carry out its actions. It's the idea that it is legitimate. It is other people recognize it as having this authority. You've probably seen that word sovereign a fair bit in your Bible classes. We talk about God being sovereign, and that means God doesn't have to turn to anyone else to do what he wants to do. He is the ultimate authority, and he can just judge according to his own righteousness, according to his goodness. And when it comes to politics, we say a state is sovereign because it can carry out actions and policies. Doesn't mean there may be different people within who make those decisions, but that's getting further down. The state is kind of the composite, everybody together who makes these decisions. And yeah, so the machinery of politics. We're going to be looking at a little kind of analogy here where we say machinery. Um, the foundational level estate acts kind of like a computer. It is the hardware on which other stuff is built. And I'm going to keep going because I'm limited to 15 minutes here. So if the state is like hardware, then we have regimes, and we'll see where they fit in with that in a bit. Regimes, this is maybe the most difficult concept because we don't talk about them as much, but regimes constitute the norms and rules regarding individual freedom and collective equality. Remember, we talked about two goals often found in societies or within states of freedom and equality. And so there's going to be different perspectives on how you pursue those. At its most basic level, we would categorize a regime as either democratic, meaning lots of voices, rule by the people. That's what democracy is, rule of the people. Or authoritarian, meaning rule by one kind of person up at top who just says how things are going to be. They are quite institutionalized, not as much as the state, and they can be changed by dramatic events like revolution, and often embodied in a constitution. This means if a new group of people comes in that really wants to alter how things are done in a society, they will probably write into law these big, we say, sweeping or like giant changes that they want to institute to yeah, make happen in the society. Okay, so some examples of regimes. You have the French Fifth Republic. This is a change of regime because it established this post-revolution government that got rid of the monarchy. So France remained intact, the state of France, but the regime completely changed how society was going to function and operate. Post-apartheid South Africa, apartheid was a system where whites and blacks had unequal status in South Africa, and then in the 90s that was altered by a new democratic regime that came in. And then in the Middle East, you have restructuring all the time. You'll have sort of like a dictator overthrown by maybe a group of Islamists. We saw a lot of upheaval during the Arab Spring where a lot of instability was happening. So, but notice the big thing here is it's not just that one dictator uh, is killed and a new dictator comes in. That wouldn't be really a change of regime. In common speech, people might talk about it that way, but really we're talking about when the system of government is altered to where, yeah, kind of the rules are set differently for how society will function. So that would be where regime comes in, and then a change of regime. So if the state is a computer, regime would be more like the software and programming. So you have the hardware, the computer, and then the regime can come in, regime, and make use of that hardware and then kind of orient how that computer functions according to the rules that it wants to set. And so it's in the middle when it comes to how institutionalized it is. Finally, you have government. So the government is the leadership or elite in charge of running the state. They have ideas about what they want to pursue, like whether it's more pushing for freedom, more pushing for equality. Maybe they're trying to do both. And they use the state to achieve those ideas. So they're not trying to just like uh, destroy the state, but they're taking that kind of foundational material that's there, and then they're going to try to set their rules and also how you execute those rules, like what type of police force you use, what the police are allowed to do, the laws that you're going to put in place. And but also the way that someone would achieve power tends to follow a pattern here. So, for example, the US, we have an election this year, and Donald Trump, of course, is the current president. He's either going to be reelected or Joe Biden most likely would become president. But they're both following the same set of rules in terms of who's going to be president following this election. Um, from there, they're going to set different policies and things. But notice that apparatus of the state, the kind of overall way things function, that stays the same. Okay, a government can also be limited by the existing regime. And this means if they push too hard, if they really want to make too big of changes, notice the government is not as institutionalized as the regime. So if they try to overdo it and make too big of changes, it can cost a government because it is weakly institutionalized. And so sure, you have, this is the officials at the top, could be elected or unelected, like the prime minister, monarch, or president. All right, so a good example of what I'm saying here is you had a guy like Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev was the um, president of the Soviet Union, and he recognized that some things weren't really working very well in the Soviet Union, uh, particularly when it came to how they were kind of oppressing their people. So he wanted to reform the Soviet Union, and that's kind of to his credit. And he had these two programs called Glasnost and Perestroika. They were intended to open up the country to kind of newer and better ideas where people could feel more open to critique things in the government and just have free speech generally, and also to restructure some ways that the government was set up. But when he kind of let that cat out of the bag and tried to make this reform happen, things just completely fell apart in the country because people saw this crack of reform and they were like, "Oh, that's nice, but that's not enough was." And so very quickly things completely fell apart in the Soviet Union. His attempt to just sort of reform the government pushed up against the regime, the way things had been done for a long time within the Soviet Union or USSR. And so this led to the Soviet Union collapsing, splintering off into a bunch of states. So the government is weakly institutionalized. This would be like the operator. You have the state, the computer, then the programming itself, and then the operator, meaning the person who's actually making use of this computer to try to make it do what you want it to. Okay, I think I'll leave with this question. So this will be one we can reflect on. I'll have you respond to, which is just from your perspective, as we have observed, some states are powerful, effective, prosperous, and stable. Others are weak, disorganized, and largely incapable of effective action, even failing to accomplish basic tasks we take for granted in countries with stronger states. Why? And I will just say here, when we talk about a state, usually when we talk about any country as a political entity, we're thinking of it as a state. So you can think of it that way. Like if you think that maybe let's say North Korea just is ineffective, why do you think that is? What makes it that way? Versus maybe South Korea, why does it work probably much better? So I will leave this here, and I know this is a bit technical, and I will just say the start of this class, the early weeks will be more technical, and then we'll get to use some of that technical information to look more deeply at actual countries and how they work. And so you can kind of get through this stuff, it will pay off. I hope y'all are doing all right.